Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Vince, and I've been doing admissions since 1989 and college counseling since 1998 in California.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Vince joins me to discuss an article that appeared in the Stanford Daily, which is their local newspaper, about how Stanford is rejecting the bill that passed in California banning legacy admissions and says we will not reject legacy admissions. So Vince and I have a vibrant conversation about that. And then our interview is Peg Keogh, part 3 of 5. Everything you really need to know about the FAFSA and the CSS PROFILE. Remember, they open up October 1st. We're talking about a lot of misperceptions and misunderstandings on those two important financial forms. And then I'm going to read that article again. Remember reading these 6 articles from the Chronicle about the money problem every college is facing. And then we have a brand new interview with Dr. Raymond Blakely from UT Austin. Very excited about that. It'll be a 4-parter. You'll hear part 1 of 4. And we have a recommended resource. And the recommended resource is so important. I'm going to do something I've never done before. Instead of playing it in the middle of the episode, I'm playing it right away. I really want you to hear what this mom sent in through SpeakPipe, because it can decrease so much stress if you'll listen. In fact, it was one of the tips that came in on our episode 500 from a parent who said how helpful this was. So listen carefully. It's the next thing you'll hear. And after that, it'll be Vince and me, and we'll be talking Stanford Legacy Admissions.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Hey, Mark and the YCBK team. I wanted to say thank you for the tip on having rising seniors use and sign up for the niche platform for direct admissions. We did that with our daughter, and she has received, as of August 7th today, 12 offers with the total scholarship amount of $248,500, which is an average of $20,708 per school. This is something we didn't even really know existed, and it was super easy to sign up, and we just loaded her unofficial transcript on there. And I'm just really grateful because she's going into school in a week and a half, and she's going into her senior year knowing that at least 12 places do want her, and that she has the grades and the background and the skills to go to college. I know sometimes students get teary-eyed at this point in the process or in a couple months from now, thinking that they're not going to end up anywhere. But I really want to encourage families out there to take a look at this platform, because it's given us all the feeling of confidence to have those yeses and for her to know that she's on the right track. Thank you all.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Vince, my man, good to see you, dude.
Thank you. It's great to see you too. It's been a great summer here in California for some reason, or at least LA. It's been cooler than usual. We just had a heat up this week, but it's not that bad. I just, when it's hot all the time, you start to lose brain cells, I feel.
Well, I'm happy when you guys aren't having fires, okay? I haven't been hearing about fires lately.
Amen. Good point.
So, Vince, we're going to talk about this hot off the press story. Literally broke 2 days ago. I found out about it because I was talking to a podcast listener named Sean. Shout out to Sean. And he was like, what do you think about Stanford? I'm like, what's up with Stanford? And he told me. So once again, we always tell you guys, you can't beat the school newspaper if you want to stay on top of things. So I'm going to read this really short entry that just came out literally, I'm saying 2 days ago. So you guys will hear this a little bit later, but this is August 6th and Vince and I are recording this August 8th. So it's from the Stanford Daily. And it says this: Stanford will continue considering legacy status while no longer being test optional for the class of 2026 admission cycle. According to the university newly released admission criteria, the move comes after Assembly Bill 1780, which will prohibit universities benefiting from state-funded financial assistance from providing a legacy preference or donor preference in admissions to be an applicant. To comply with the new bill, Stanford will withdraw from the Cal Grant, a state-sponsored fund that supports California students in financial need. The university will be replacing state-funded student financial aid with university funding, keeping our students' financial support whole, wrote Brad Howard, Associate VP of University Communications. Regarding legacy admissions, Howard said there are important issues on which there are many perspectives. He added that the university will conduct continued study and analysis on the issue. And it goes on to say, well, Stanford will continue considering applicants' legacy status. University will no longer be test optional for 2026. So this was an announcement they made last year, so that's nothing we knew. We knew about the test optional. So that's not the news here. The news is the legacy status.
Yeah.
And so that's what I wanted to talk with you about, Vince, and just tell me what your thoughts are.
Well, my initial thought is, once again, money is a very important part of this process, and lest we forget that is one of the primary things. And again, it sort of sets up this situation where people with immense privilege, like they have resources to start testing in fourth grade or prepping for testing in fourth grade, and then if you can somehow manage to have legacy. I remember once, Mark, I was working with a student and she seemed unusually nervous. Everyone who applies to Stanford is nervous about the result because it's so hard to get in. But she said, well, I have a lot of, family legacy. And I said, oh, you didn't mention that before. How many, what's the legacy? And she said, 16 family members had gone to Stanford. So she went to Stanford.
Sure. 17 now.
That's funny. Yeah, good point. But I guess when it's such an interesting decision. I mean, there's some good things. Stanford has the endowment to back up the loss of Cal Grant money, which can be quite significant. I think the Cal Grant amount that they get per student is about $9,000 every year. It changes depending on how the California budget is, but that's a significant amount. So if they've got, somewhere between 40 and 60% of their admitted students who are or students at Stanford who get Cal Grant aid, that's a lot of money.
When Vince said 40 to 60%, he was not talking about the overall Stanford student body, but a sector of the class.
But in terms of donor and alumni contributions, and considering that in their process, one thing I wondered too, this is just another question because the bill doesn't mention it, but I felt like one of the perks of working at Stanford is if you're a faculty or staff member, they definitely take it into account in the admissions process.
Sure.
But I wondered if that was part of the, alumni and donor part bill as well. So I
doubt it, because they never said anything about that. And I would think faculty would be considered its own class,
Well,
that's but what I find interesting is, and you nailed it, I think some people, maybe if they don't know how these schools work, they might think, wait a minute, we're talking about legacy. Why did Vince go to money right away? And because this is a financial decision they're making, right?
Yes,
They're
yes.
literally, now let's face it, they're in that Silicon Valley. There's a lot of very, very wealthy
Mm-hmm.
Stanford alum in
Mm-hmm.
that area and around the world. And they're like, we can't piss these people off and not take their kids. And we're not going to get the next 5, 10, 20, $50 million donation. So, my understanding, Vince, is that the Cal grant for a UC student this year taking 12 units is like over 14,900.
Oh, wow. Much
Yeah.
higher. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Less for CSU, around a little over 6,000. But so the fact that they're like, yeah, we'll pass on that money, and maybe we should give a little background. So, what would you say, Vince? Has it been about a year now since that law passed in California,
Yes, yes,
outlawing legacy admissions for public and private schools and donor admissions?
yes, yes. And it was interesting. There wasn't in this last cycle, I didn't really hear anybody talk about it. No,
Hmm.
not USC, although I think Pomona and Caltech were probably already made clear they weren't sort of recognizing alumni status, but Stanford never backed away from donor. Because you're right, Mark, it's not just the alumni, it's all that money
Yeah,
in Silicon Valley. And
yeah, yeah.
there's a lot of money that can come from Asia to if they admit one person, or
Sure.
it starts being a family there. I think the it's clearly somebody did the cost benefit analysis and realized that they can raise more money than they would spend giving up that money, because it's not just one class, it's all the classes that get that Cal grant aid.
Yeah. No, well said. And yeah, I mean, you've got really two big sources of money for colleges, other than endowment, like on a regular basis. And that's, tuition revenue and then donations. And so that's a huge reason why legacy is so important for these schools. So it's just a business decision, but I find it interesting on two levels. One, there is this blowback, especially from the younger generation, against legacy admission. Friends, I thought you may be interested in hearing what has happened at the state level regarding legacy admissions for the last 5 years. The following states have implemented bans on legacy admissions. In some cases, it is only for public colleges, but in a few cases, it's been for public and private colleges. Now, we talked about this 5 years ago when Colorado became the first state to ban legacy admissions. We did it in the news on this, and that went into effect in 2021. But it was only for public colleges when Colorado did it. In March of 2024, Virginia passed HB 48, and this bill prevented public colleges from giving preference to legacy admissions and to kids or to donor kids. And that went into effect in July of 2024. Now, Virginia Tech was very supportive of this. UVA had a very mixed response to that legislation. Now, things got really heated in Massachusetts because first there was Bill H 1282 in 2023. There was a bill that introduced by Michael Moran to ban legacy admissions for public colleges. And a real earthquake emerged because Massachusetts has so many private, wealthy colleges, especially in the greater Boston area. And then Bill S821 was introduced that scared the bejesus out of those wealthy private schools in Boston, because this bill attempted to ban legacy admissions at all private schools in Massachusetts. Now, the colleges are happy because that bill didn't pass. However, the issue is not dead. Lydia Edwards introduced the bill again recently. I'm talking 2025. So momentum is still around, and it's also carried over to many other states. Maryland took what Colorado did. Remember, Colorado was the first school ever to ban legacy admission for public schools to a whole new level when they became the first state to ban legacy admissions for public and private colleges. And that went into effect in July of 2024, making the alum of Johns Hopkins want to roll over in their grave. And that leads us up to what Vince and I have been discussing here. California followed Maryland and banned legacy admissions for public and private universities effective September 2025. That's next month, or less than a month. So that's why Vince and I have been speculating and wondering, what are some of the other very wealthy California colleges going to do? And when you think of wealthy schools in California, the first schools you're going to think of other than Stanford are going to be Pomona, Claremont, McKenna, and USC. The other two schools that I'm really curious how they're going to respond are Harvey Mudd, which is also a Claremont college, and Santa Clara. Because Harvey Mudd, Santa Clara, USC, Stanford, they're the wealthy schools that have admitted that they do have practice legacy admissions. You may remember we talked about this on the podcast, but it didn't get as much fanfare as when Amherst dropped it, but Pomona dropped legacy admissions a few years ago. So it's really not going to impact Pomona. Now, legacy admissions is very unpopular with Generation Z. Generation Z is those born from the mid to late 90s up to 2010. And I'm going to read a portion of an article that appeared in the Brown Herald, which is the Brown's daily newspaper. We can't talk enough about reading school newspapers, right? To want to see what's going on. Now, we talked about this on the podcast as well. And this article came out in 2023. It was by editor-in-chief Neil Mehta. I'm just going to read a brief portion of it. Over 100 students gathered on the main green Thursday, calling for the university to end legacy admissions and to move to test optional admissions process. What matters? Race matters, the students shouted. The rally, led by Students for Educational Equity and the Undergraduate Council of Students, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, was organized ahead of the Supreme Court's expected decision to overturn affirmative action later this year. Our diversity is our strength, said Nayanta Nepal, class of 2025, and the co-president. To the crowd at the rally, affirmative action is a critical tool in this effort as it allows us to level the playing field for historically underrepresented communities. In the possible absence of affirmative action, Nepal called on the university to permanently commit to test optional admissions, a policy that has been temporarily in place for prospective undergraduates since 2021. Now, once again, this is a 2023 article, so we know Brown has come out and rejected test optional admissions, but I'm reading you this 2023 article. The article also says, a spokesman for the university did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Nepal also called for the university to abolish legacy admissions, which allows admission officers to consider whether an applicant's family members attended the university. The policy has no place in our university, she said. Legacy admissions rob seats from systemically marginalized populations, according to the former SEE co-president, Zoe Fouad. It is far past time to end this archaic policy. Many Brown students said, if you don't ban legacy admissions, we will never give you one red penny for the rest of our lives. However, this is a problem. I'm not reading from the article now, I'm just ad-libbing. The problem for them is that 20-year-olds are broke, but the 40 through 80-year-olds have the cash that funds so many of the school's programs and initiatives. So I just wanted you to read that just to get a little bit of a sense of the 5-year history and how students are kind of championing it on the forefront of this movement. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times the way admission officers present it, they don't necessarily present it as it's much of a thumb on the scale. They don't give the impression that, well, it's there, but, it's not significant. But this is screaming loud that it's significant because you're going to walk away from like over $14,900 of Cal grant money and replace it with your own money. So this is screaming loud. No, legacy's that important to us that we're going to buck the law. This is like doing a Hillsdale or back in the day, Bob Jones, when they opted out of federal regulation. And said they'll just do their own thing. And, there's been some schools that have done that on the conservative side over federal policies. So to me, and especially as the first major school to do it, they're going to get all the incoming that comes with that. They're going to take all the incoming. Wow, see? The deck really is stacked against me. You talk about fairness and equity. I knew something was rigged. So I think listen, I understand why they did it, just a financial decision, but get ready to take the incoming that comes with that. That's one thought I have. And then the second thought, did you see, like, this news just literally broke yesterday? Like, the Trump administration is mandating that basically every single school in the country, like, dismantle affirmative action and a bunch of other things.
Mhm.
And we're going to talk about a little bit of that coming up here, in the near future. Vince and I are doing a series of articles, so I'll save some on my fire a little bit for that. But it's interesting because at the one time while you're embracing legacy admissions, you're getting rid of affirmative action. I remember Ketanji Brown Jackson on the Supreme Court case on affirmative action. She eloquently and powerfully said, "So let me see if I've got this correct.
Here it comes.
You know what I mean?
Here it
People's
comes.
historic disadvantage of hundreds of years of slavery, segregation, and all that can't be taken into account at all, but people's advantage, like legacy, can." And that argument was so powerful that a lot of people felt that even it swayed even some of the conservative justices to have them taking a ruling that we all knew what was happening, but it actually, the result of that ruling was actually even better than we thought, because they did carve out and say race can still be considered if you can make the case that it's impacted you. And people felt that that was largely influenced by Ketanji Brown Jackson making that argument. Now you got the current administration going in the direction of trying to completely abrogate anything at all to do with affirmative action, while at the same time you have this loud embracing of legacy. So those are some of my thoughts. And then how is Stanford going to handle that target on their back? Another thought is, did they just open the Pandora's box and now so many other schools follow suit?
Yeah, that's the great question. I think that in regards to your comment about the Trump administration and the Supreme Court ruling and sort of a pushing affirmative action into other facets of diversity work. So in hiring, so they're sort of like saying, it's not good here, so therefore it's not going to be, it's against the law everywhere. And that's not what the Supreme Court said. They were talking about one particular facet of college admission. And they weren't, making a blanket statement for everyone. But I think that there are groups and individuals that would like it to be expanded to hiring, to employment, to lots of things. But without, it's so interesting because I think it's not just, the legacy part, but it's also the donor part. So
and I'm focusing most so let's face it. If there were no this is being done for the donors, not because of legacy. It's just that there's a higher percentage of legacy that are donor.
Yes.
That's why they're willing to eat the money on Cal Grant, because it's just a cost benefit analysis. Mm-hmm. That's not about legacy. That's about donor. And we've always known that at some of the most selective schools in the country, being legacy doesn't really do much unless it's legacy and either donor or legacy and super active involvement. Like, sometimes you've had people that maybe gave $1 to $5 grand for 10, 15, 20 years, but they were chair of their class, and they did all the fundraising and all that. That stuff can matter too. But it's mostly about donor. A funny story, Dave, Dave, he really, really had kind of hoped his daughter would go to Princeton and sort of follow in his footsteps. Of course, she ended up not even rejecting Princeton, and she just liked Yale more. But he went into the counseling office at the Lab School, which is a school in Chicago that his daughter attended. And he was talking to the college counselor in there. And he was saying, I'm legacy at Princeton and blah, 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 blah. And you know what the counselor said?
What?
What building is your name on?
Oh.
If your building isn't on a name, they had a much, much better success at labs at Yale than they had at Princeton.
So
the counselor was making out, if your name isn't on a building, you can talk all that legacy stuff all you want. And we know it's not always that, but donations is really what it is.
Yeah, I think there's two things I want to say. One quick story. I had a student whose family did have a building at Stanford. and the name was on the building. But then development came back and said, we gave one generation
Wow.
the push, three of you.
Wow.
That the person who gave it died. The money spread out all over the place. Now we're done. And that their face just dropped like, wow. I mean, and it sort of points to, if people are watching, there's a great news sort of kind of soapy drama on Max called The Gilded Age, and it's about how new money supplants and changes organizations and structures and class, because wealth, new wealth especially, that those people can come in, those individuals or families with immense wealth can come in and sort of supplant other people who feel like, wow, your tie is only financial, and maybe you're strong enough to say, okay, we're going to admit you. You know, a good example is Jared Kushner.
Oh yeah, that $2
And
million, and that $2 million then in today's money is a lot more. Oh, you might want to explain. Some people might not know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So all the Trumps, every single Trump, from the president to probably all the siblings, benefited from some. Well, they have been his sibling, her kids were, alumni. Maybe there was donor, we don't know. Trump originally went to Fordham, and then a year later transferred to Wharton. His son-in-law was a student, I believe, in some independent school in New York. His father made a contribution to Harvard, and he went to Harvard.
Yeah, it was over 2 mil, and that was some time ago. So the 2 mil in today's dollars is a lot more. I have a funny story. It's not funny, really. It's kind of sad how this stuff works, and sometimes I don't like talking about this stuff on the podcast because I think, man, we're just discouraging people. Like, what can I do with that? But sometimes I also, like to get into this stuff too and let people know how the sausage can be made. This is a boarding school related thing, but it's the same concept happens. So I used to recruit the Upper East Side. That was part of my territory. So, there's crazy money in the Upper East Side, right? Like, they're ridiculous. They're paying like $50K to go to kindergarten there. And
wow.
So I'd work with the placement directors there. And I'm not going to mention which school I'm talking about, but there's 4 very prominent Upper East Side schools, and people in New York know what they are. So the placement director was telling me that he gets, New York got that sick Wall Street money. So he would get, and those families are the ones at the school. So, most years he'd have at least one family that would approach him and say, what's the number? What's the number? Meaning, how big of a check do I need to write to get my kid into Deerfield or Lawrenceville or Andover, Exeter or Hotchkiss, Choate, Groton, whatever those schools that St. Paul's, those schools that that's sort of the Ivy League of boarding schools. I just what I threw out there, Milton's and others. So then the placement director would be like, look, this is, going to be a little unsavory for you to walk into the school and say, what's the number? So kind of let me handle it. So then he would go behind the scenes and talk to the people in the development office and find out what the number was. And then transactions would happen, all that nobody knows behind the scenes. And then little kiddo gets in. And so that's how this stuff can work. And I think Stanford's just saying, this is the reality. This is going to be in our financial interest. And I know we got a couple more articles we're recording, Vince. I guess we'll pick this back up when we talk about Duke, and maybe we'll keep in separate lanes. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the financial challenges. And I am sympathetic. But listen, anything else on this one? Or you want to call it a wrap?
The question I'm going to leave people with is what I think Caltech and Pomona had already sort of said no to the alumni nod. But I wonder what USC will do.
Oh, I think I know what that's going to. Well, I don't know,
Do they have the money?
Well, that's why I said. First, I said we know what they're going to do because they have wealthy donors too. But then they don't have Stanford money to replace that. And then that's a really bad look to say we're doing legacy and we're not replacing Cal Grant.
Right. And
So I don't know.
They're still admitting kids for fall, and they
Yeah.
start next week.
Yeah. Yeah. That's insane. That's insane.
Yeah,
No.
what it's just fascinating to me, and this I think it's the theme of our
Mm-hmm.
discussion today, how one administration can really impact multiple structures and organizations in the United States.
Oh yeah. I mean, look what's happening to laws, to law firms. Look what's happening to CBS, to ABC. Now you're trying to go after the NFL and telling and CEOs and telling them just this week, Intel's CEO stepped down immediately. Telling. I mean, yeah, it. Well, I think if this election, listen, there's no question in my mind whatsoever. They're going to try to rig 2026 and 2028. There's no
Yeah.
doubt about that. You already stormed the Capitol once to try to not lose and still claim it's rigged. There's no way in the world you want to give power up. If this election goes in that direction, it's over. I mean, because when you look at the things that are happening right now, we are not functioning like a democracy. We're functioning like an authoritarian regime. And this is the playbook Hungary used. Completely following everything Orban did. Get the big CEOs, get the courts, get the Congress, shut down the media. And I think still think there's a naivete in this country. Think, we're a democracy to return in 50 years. This is who we are. We're America. No, read, Ann Applebaum. She's been quite eloquent, as have others on this topic. So this election, I think, is America's last chance, or you're going to go into a really dark place for a long time. And so we'll see what happens. I'm an optimist, so I'm going to think the best and hope for the best. But I just think that's actually what's at stake. Yeah. So especially 2028, but 2026 is going to be important too, because 2 more years of this stuff at this breakneck pace, man, it's pretty scary.
Yeah. And you can already see the machinations, trying to reform congressional districts before next year's election.
I mean, arresting congressmen. I mean, it's just all of the authoritarianism, the dictator's playbooks. Anyway, let's get off a little. Sometimes politics interfaces with higher ed, and I don't want to duck any issues. But good conversation. I know we're recording 3 weeks in a row on 3 different topics, so I know we got 2 more juicy ones coming up the next 2 weeks. So we'll see you next week, Vince.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Awesome.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, time for part 3 of my interview with Peg Keogh. In part 3, Peg talks about the changes from the old FAFSA to the new FAFSA. We transition to talk about some CSS profile specific missed opportunities. Peg talks about questions that you do not have to answer on the profile. Peg talks about the special circumstances situation. Peg shares her 3 commandments when filling out these forms. I share a few stories from my life experience that relate to the point Peg is making. Peg explains how much flexibility colleges have when interpreting and applying the data from the profile compared to the FAFSA. Peg talks about why there are more Pell Grant recipients now than there used to be. Peg talks about some profile-specific mistakes students make. And we start a good conversation about home equity. Peg talks about not oversharing. Peg gives an example of a question you don't need to answer. Peg talks about the flexibility and subjectivity colleges look at when they interpret a profile. Peg talks about how she advises college students to handle the special circumstances section. Finally, Peg talks about the projected income question, and she shares how she advises families to handle this question. Listen and enjoy.
I have had situations like that where there's a huge difference in income, and depending on where that child is spending most of the time, that can be a big deal. Because if the child's spending all their time with the parent that makes less money, and that parent is paying a mortgage and paying utilities and paying, that's all part of supporting that child. So that's where it comes into, in your example, Mark, he makes 450 or she makes 450, whichever parent that was. This other parent doesn't make as much. Alimony and all that, that's paid to the parent. That's not paid to the kids and it's not earmarked for the kids. So when that parent gets that alimony and uses it to support the child, they're supporting the child. So every situation is different, and I've had a few of those too where I'm like, I my whole talk track is, if you're being honest and you can honestly say that even if there is a huge gap, and if you're asked, you can say, this was our logic, this was our reasoning, then go ahead and do it, right? But, if somebody's just like, I just want to do this because it's better. I mean, when I'm in those relationships, I'm like, you're not doing that with my advice. Go ahead and do it, but I'm not, that's not my counsel that you're following when you do that.
Well, the interesting thing in this case was they were trying to sort of dot their I's and cross their T's a little. So they did reach out and talk to financial aid. And what financial aid said to them was, we don't get involved in that and we just trust that you'll do the right thing. And
Yeah.
that's sort of the response they got from financial aid. And so they proceeded to move forward.
Well, yeah, if they get that feedback, then that's giving them kind of a seal of approval. I wouldn't say that every college will do that. That's great that they did their homework and they got that answer from a specific college, but I wouldn't expect every school. They're always on the lookout because most parents are honest, and even if they do something wrong, it's usually an honest error. They just don't know that they're making a mistake. And the college will reach out and say, are you sure you don't have any assets? Because you have a lot of dividends, that kind of thing. But there are some bad actors out there. Just, not most parents, but so they are watching for that in different areas. And the CSS profile, they're looking at your tax return. And the FAFSA schools can verify. They do verification, and they can ask for tax returns too. So I think you want to be honest. That's my talk track with everybody I work with.
And I appreciate you saying not all schools are going to just say, we don't get involved. We trust that you do the right thing. I appreciate you bringing that perspective because I wouldn't want people to think it always works that way. I mean, I kind of told them, listen, they can see tax returns. I mean, the income here is like 15 times the income over there. Like that feels very risky to me. But
Yeah,
these
be
things,
ready to answer their questions if they
yeah.
reach out to you. They're going to have to be ready to do that. Last year was a weird year because it was so crazy and messed up with the FAFSA that I think most colleges, it's not a year that I can look for data on how the schools responded to anything because everybody was in triage mode, well, even past May 1st of last year. So this year should be a more, quote unquote, normal year to see how colleges handle stuff.
Peg, before we transition to some CSS profile specific missed opportunities, there may be a family that, has had a student out there under the old FAFSA, and now the new FAFSA is coming in. They kind of think they have this FAFSA down, but now this is all new to them. What are some things you'd want to highlight as just significant differences for people to be aware of if they're used to the old form and now they have the new one?
Yeah. One of the biggest things is in the past, you could move your tax information from the IRS, but you had a choice. So it's, and I always told my clients do it manually and then go back and use the DRT later because I wanted to make sure it was in there correctly. Now you don't have the choice. Basically, you consent to have the IRS move your financial information, your tax information, they call it FTI, into your part of the FAFSA, which will be part of your child's FAFSA. It'll tell you it's doing it and it's done, hopefully correctly, unless you fall into an exception and then they'll prompt you to manually enter it. So that's the first main difference. The second big difference we've already talked about, if you're divorced or separated, the parent that's going to submit that FAFSA could be a different parent. It's not about where they're sleeping. It's about who's providing more of the financial support. The other really big one is if you have more than one child in school at once, and in my case, it was all the time because I have twins. They used to say, okay, you can afford when they calculated what was called an EFC, it's now called a student aid index. They would say, well, this family can afford 40,000 a year. Well, in my case, they would say But for you guys, the Keogh family, it's about 20,000 because we know you have two kids to pay for. They don't do that anymore. So if you have twins or you have a junior and a senior, you have the seniors off in college, the junior's going to come this fall. Those colleges are not going to reduce the amount they think you can afford because you have two in school. They know you have two in school because there's a question on the FAFSA that asks how many are going to be in college for that school year. So you can absolutely reach out to the college and say, hey guys, I know it's not part of the formula anymore with the FAFSA changes, but we'd like you to take it into account to give out your institutional money. They can absolutely do that. The Department of Ed has put their seal of approval on it. Like analogous to what I was talking about before, I did not see that last year because there was too much triage going on. We'll see this year if parents actually appeal on that and see how the colleges respond. I will say the CSS profile also gives you credit about 30 to 40% reduction. And we're seeing at most of those schools, they're continuing to do it. So that doesn't affect the CSS profile, but it absolutely affects the FAFSA. So those are the three biggest changes that affect most families.
And another one is sort of how business value and farm value is handled now in the
Yeah.
FAFSA versus before. Do you want to talk about that? I was
Yeah,
thinking about that when we were talking
it
about
used to,
overestimating business value, because we that probably would have only been on the CSS profile before, but we have that as one of our general points due to those changes. Why don't you talk about that?
yeah, so it used to be on the FAFSA that business value needed to be entered, but if you were a small family-owned business with less than 100 full-time employees, it was off the table. So most people were like, that's me, check the box. I don't have to fill anything in there. With the changes, they said, nope, all businesses are on the table. So when I had my business, I would have had to value it and put it on there. And we've talked about the not overvaluing, but that's a good call, Mark. That's another big one because I don't know the stats of how many businesses basically didn't have to be included with those rules, but I would guess a lot of businesses, because most businesses aren't IBM, right? Most businesses are smaller shops and they could be family owned. And if you have over 100 full-time employees, that's a considerable business. So that does affect a lot of people that it didn't before.
Yeah, and one other one I'd love you to comment on is like the percentage of students that qualify for Pell is higher than it used to be due to some changes on the new FAFSA. Anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, they expanded it, and I don't have the stat in my head, but there's a decent percentage more of kids based on the data from last year that are receiving the Pell. I mean, that was a big part of what Congress was trying to do, was trying to make it we're trying to make college more affordable for everybody and especially the lower income tiers. The Pell actual amount of the Pell hasn't changed, and I hope that will start to change, because it used to go up and it hasn't gone up.
Friends, after listening to the recording, I realized I forgot to ask Peg about another common missed opportunity when completing the profile. Friends, have you ever heard of all kinds of different numbers when people say how many schools require the profile? You'll hear 180, you'll hear 200, 250, 300, and even 400. The reason for this is because on the profile, there can be as many as 5 different listings for the same university.
But the number of kids qualifying, it's based on, there's two different ways that they base it on, and it's more inclusive of including more kids. So that's one of the best changes they made to really help a lot of families.
Let's talk about some of the profile specific missed opportunities. So, overvaluing primary home equity. We've kind of talked around the skirts of edges of this one already, but anything else you want to say?
No, this is just basically the same talk track we've talked about with secondary real estate. They're going to ask you specifically, are you renting? Do you own? What's your market value? What's your mortgage? When did you buy your house? Da 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 da. that market value, just, don't overvalue it. That's the key thing, just like with secondary real estate.
Yeah. And here's a new one, answering all of the not required questions. I've heard you emphasize this quite a bit when I've seen you do webinars. So talk about this one.
Yeah, so on CSS, a little different than the FAFSA, where you just put zero if that's the answer. It says required and on certain questions, and you can't get past that page if you don't fill it in. But a lot of questions are not required. So I wouldn't say on a podcast or any of our webinars, all you families out there, never answer a not required question, because it might be advantageous to you to answer a not required question. But many of the questions you just don't need to answer. One, it makes the form a lot easier, and there's 300 questions plus. I mean, it's a pain, as Mark and I have shared. So it makes it easier. Two, when you submit these forms, you're going to be uploading all your tax documents. So when they ask you to put line 2A and 2B and 3A, they're going to see all that. You're not trying to hide, you're not trying to be dishonest. It makes it easier to complete. And sometimes, some of that information you're going to want to share on appeal. Honestly, you're going to want to hold it in your pocket and play those cards later. So that's what we usually tell people. Pay attention to that. Don't just go through and say, oh, there's 10 questions on this page, I have to answer all of them. Because a lot of them might be not required. So just planting that seed, keep that in mind when you're in the CSS profile.
Can you think of an example, Peg, of a specific question on the profile that you would be like, I wouldn't answer that one. It's not required. You don't need to answer. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, they ask for the parent's educational level, right? And then there'll be a drop down. And I always tell parents, like, just leave it. If you have a master's degree or a PhD and you pick that applicable drop down, they're going to make assumptions about you based on that information that you've shared. And it's probably not a great assumption, right? But some families, if the parent didn't complete high school, might say to put that, it depends, but that one I usually say a lot of parents like it's none of their business and it's probably not going to help you. That's an example that comes to mind.
We should probably talk just in general before we talk about a few more of these specifics. Why don't you talk a little bit about just how much individual flexibility schools have with the profile? I'll oftentimes explain it like a smorgasbord, right? You've got these 300 things, and one school's pulling one lever where they're looking at what a sibling paid for their K-12 tuition. And then another school is saying that's completely discretionary money. That's nothing to do with us. And there's a lot of things like that on the profile. Do you want to just in general talk about the flexibility that the individual college has with the profile compared to the FAFSA?
Yeah, they have a lot of flexibility. It gets very subjective. I mean, they have to follow some, it can't come out that like they treat a certain race a certain way. They can't do that kind of thing, but I've seen it time and time again where they'll get in a situation for home equity, for example. If they look at home equity, they have discretion of how much home equity they're going to look at, right? And they base it on whatever they're basing it on. So it's their money, so they do have a lot of flexibility. That's why I tell parents, if anybody tells you that they can tell you exactly what you're going to get from a college, run, because they're lying to you. There is, especially with the CSS profile schools, there's a lot of subjectivity. And if that scares you hearing that, it take a deep breath. It's all good. That's why there's appeal processes. And if you understand all the flexibility they can have, and you understand what in the ballpark of what you should be getting from a certain college and you don't, you can appeal. You can have conversations with them. And I've done this hundreds of times, hey, how much home equity are you including? And you kind of sometimes you call them on some of these things they're doing behind the curtain, I like to say. But to your question, Mark, tons of flexibility that they have.
And even with the questions, sometimes you might be asked, what are the make and models of your car? I'm sure you've seen that one. What are your thoughts on that? But then not every school has that question.
Yeah, that's a supplemental question. So when you finish, then your schools might even ask you more questions. And I always say, none of their business, none of their business, none of their business. If they really want to know those answers, they can reach out to that family. I've never had a family come back to me and say they've done that in my mind. But at that point, parents are getting to the point where they're literally getting ticked off because it's like, really? But they don't realize I've never, knock on wood, I've never seen a supplemental question that's required. Never. So I usually, when we get to that point, I'm like, nope, nope, nope. Just don't answer. Don't answer. They want to know, they'll ask you. And I haven't seen them do that. But yeah, the make and model is the first time I saw that one, that was a fun one. I'm like, really? I mean, I think what they want to make sure is people don't have three Bentleys on their driveway, and they're asking for need-based financial aid, but
Well, I
it does get a
remember,
little intrusive.
yeah, I remember when I used to do boarding school admissions, and the financial aid director, his office was not that far from mine, and he did not like it when he would see, you know, really, really expensive cars and then knowing people were getting money. So, it's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that gets into, okay, what's their decision tree? Like I look at their income, should they really have that car? Was that a good choice? And that's the kind of thing where if it's not required, you don't have to give them that amount of visibility into your decisions.
so let's talk about this one, Peg, because this is really important. Completing the special circumstances section. I know you could probably talk all day on this, but what should our listeners know about this?
Yeah, so the CSS profile, unlike the FAFSA, at the end says, would you like to tell us about any special circumstances? And they have some categories and you can check a box. This one, I pretty much categorically tell people, leave it blank because you want to share that information, but you want to share it on appeal and you want to share it in the right way. If you put it on there, and most people get into long emotional novel, which is not the best way to do it, but then the college comes back and says, you're admitted, here's your package. And then you say, well, that's not what we were expecting. I told you about my job loss, da da da. And they say, yeah, we saw that. We took that into account. You're kind of backed into a corner. Whereas if you submit it, you get the package, maybe get some aid, and then you say, thank you very much. Now I need to tell you about some changes in our circumstances. Then you're kind of making them look at new information, take it into account, and come back. And usually it's much more successful than spilling your guts on the form. That's the logic behind it.
Do you run a risk of the money running out by doing that? Like that delays the process versus the person who explained, the special circumstances of, let's say it was grandma who moved in and lived with us and had all these additional expenses that they might have put on the front in the special circumstances. Do you run any risk that the money could run out in the time between then and the appeal?
There's always a risk. Life's full of risks. So that's always a risk. If you're on top of it and you submit your appeal and you're ready to submit your appeal, you should be okay. But yeah, and I always tell people these are your forms. So if you're staring up at that ceiling at night thinking, I really wanted to fill that in, I tell people fill it in. Well, I'll help you do it. Put your best foot forward. If that's how you're going to sleep at night, go for it. It's just we do this all the time. And it's just we're very successful on appeal and it's just very helpful. I'm not saying that the colleges ignore what's put in there. I'm not saying that at all. This way, you're just more of the driver of the process as opposed to just putting it in there and they might read through it quickly and maybe not even completely understand it. And you can always appeal even if you put it in the special circumstances to make sure they get it. So it's just that's what we tell people to do. I have had people that it's making their skin crawl not to share. And so I tell them to share.
No, I think
It's not,
that's
it's
a
not
good
like it's going to be
policy.
terrible for them if they share.
Always best to do what you're at peace with. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Overstating your projected income. Talk about this, and projected's the key word, right? There's that question in the profile about next year's income.
Yeah, again, the CSS profile much much more invasive. So people that are looking at it now, they're like, what happened in 2024? Well, if you're in 2024 and they're asking, it's the same talk track. don't overestimate. I tell people, don't put in a bonus that you got the year before because you're doing really well. Put the minimum amount you know you're going to make. And I've had people that are like, I've lost my job, Peg. And I say, put 0. You don't have another job right now when you're hitting submit, put 0, because you aren't making any money, and you don't have a guaranteed job offer that starts in 3 months. So it's just that it's the same thing. Like I always say, my 3 commandments for the financial aid forms are: be honest, don't overshare, and don't overestimate. And it's the same thing with this question. They ask you to project further. It's really not part of the calculation, but it's this whole psychological, they're looking at this family and making assumptions based on the data they're looking at.
Friends, this concludes this segment of an interview with Peg Keogh, Chief Academic Officer at College Aid Pro. Hope you join us next week for the next part. Okay, friends, 2 weeks ago, I said I'm so concerned about the financial challenges that colleges have that for 6 or 7 weeks in a row, I'm going to address it by just reading you brief excerpts from the Chronicle. And I also said, if you're not signed up for the Chronicle and getting their daily newsletters, I don't know a better way to stay in touch with what's going on in higher ed. It's really worth your $10 a month. They don't give me a penny for that, but I'm just trying to help. So the Chronicle produced an excellent article called "The Money Problem No College Can Escape," subtitled 6 Views on How Higher Ed's Business Model is Cracking and What to Do About It. Now, 2 weeks ago, I read an article from a higher financial aid administrator at Furman, and I said that I was next week, which was last week, by the way, I would read an article from a Johns Hopkins professor, but I totally forgot. I just forgot and said, snap, after I hit send, the podcast went, I said, I never read that article. So I got a little reminder system now, so we should be good. So I'm going to read this article, short and brief. Sorry there's so much reading today. It just kind of worked out that way. This is by a professor at Johns Hopkins. I'm going to try my best not to butcher the name. Francois Furstenberg. This is a history professor, and the title of his entry is called "Growing Beyond Our Means." He comes out swinging with aggression. I mean, he's pulverizing folks. Pugnacity is like an understatement. Let me read it, and I'll have a few comments. So here's what Francois Furstenberg, history professor at Johns Hopkins, has to say about the money problem colleges are facing. You might see why the Trump administration is trying to ban things like history and sociology after you hear what he has to say. Johns Hopkins University, where I teach, receives more federal money than any other university. For us, the politicization and weaponization of research funding poses an existential threat. Though Hopkins may be uniquely vulnerable, we're hardly alone. By capriciously withholding research grants, taxing endowments, and threatening international student tuition, the Trump administration is engaged in a no-holds-barred assault on the fiscal foundations of the American research university. It's time to abandon wishful thinking, along with any quisling notion that institutions can negotiate in good faith with an administration whose goal is to control American universities or to destroy those who won't submit to them. In the short term, universities that hope to maintain freedom of thought and research have no choice but to resist with every tool at their disposal. That means unequivocally challenging the Trump administration's legal and unconstitutional actions. It means building coalitions and using every available resource. So far, universities have mobilized little of their imposing arsenal. American higher ed comprises some of the nation's finest minds. Our political scientists have spent decades studying authoritarian regimes. Our legal scholars and historians have demonstrated the rich democratic resources of our constitutional systems. Think of our authorities in taxation and finance. Why have universities not turned more to their extraordinary in-house expertise? The answer, I fear, leads us to boards of trustees, many of which are drawn from the same elite worlds as big law and private equity that have capitulated with such alacrity to the Trump administration, and many of which may even be hostile to the idea of universities as centers of independent thought. The longer-term response to the Trumpian assault, therefore, is to transform the ways universities make major strategic decisions. Here is one benefit of the current moment, if there is one. It casts a harsh light on the extent to which even our country's private research universities have grown beyond their ability to support themselves. The surge in federal spending during the Cold War famously helped create the modern American university. Most recent pressures, however, have pushed universities to behave like for-profit companies, with leadership drawn from the corporate world. We're often told we have to do what donors want because they pay the bills. Except it turns out they don't. At some institutions like mine, the largest share of revenue comes from faculty-generated grants. Perhaps it's time to start giving us more say on how the money is spent. That's Francois Furstenberg, professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. So my thought on this is simply, when someone is a history professor with tenure, they have the freedom of thought to say whatever they want. So he can just express his opinion unabashedly without worrying about the consequences. But when you're a president or a board, part of your job is overseeing the fiscal safety, sanity, and health of your institution. And so when you're looking at losing billions or hundreds of millions or tens of millions, even for smaller schools, it's incredibly hard to not think of what can I do to avoid that from happening. So while I respect highly what Harvard is doing in standing up and all the other colleges that have stood up, I also am sympathetic to the very difficult position that places like Brown, Columbia, and others are in, because when you're looking at losing $1 billion or $500 million, you're like, that's going to completely transform our institution. So do we just completely gut professors and lay off whole departments and slash financial aid? You're really caught between a rock and a hard place. Neither option is good. But all these different 6 perspectives I'm going to read, they're all different people in different roles, and they come at it from different angles. That's why I thought the Chronicle did such a good job. I mean, I've never held back my opinion from you guys. I don't think there's a single word that he said that I don't agree with. The professor. He spoke my mind very eloquently. But I also know his job is just to go teach and to understand how the past has impacted the future. He's a historian. He's not sitting there looking like, okay, if I do what I want to do we really want to have to experience like what Duke's having right now, 600 layoffs and many other schools, all this different consequences. So I just really feel for others. Hope it doesn't sound like I'm making excuses. I'd like to think that I would take the Harvard path, but I'm just not going to criticize others, because the consequences of standing up when you have the full weight of the federal government against you and a politically motivated Department of Justice bent on vindictiveness and revenge, that's just an awful lot to try to be Superman and take that on solo. But I think his point is really well taken. We need to bandy together. If people would bandy together, you'd have a lot more power. Some of that's happened, but it just hasn't happened to the extent that it probably should. Anyway, just my thoughts. You're going to hear many different perspectives. In fact, next one is very different. It's entitled, "It's Not All About Politics." That's the next one. It's by Gary Stalker. He has a very different perspective. He's the founder of College Viability, LLC. And so, once again, I'll be reading these 6 different perspectives for 6 consecutive weeks, and hopefully I won't forget like I did last week. Hopefully you guys help this. Once again, sorry for so much reading on this episode.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, have you ever stubbed your toe? I know it sucks, doesn't it? not only are you in pain, but there's no one to blame but yourself. At least when you're in a traffic jam on the freeway, it isn't your fault. Well, I stubbed my toe in this interview. I loved reconnecting with Raymond, and I was stoked when I finished this interview. Originally Raymond had blocked out 30 minutes, but he gave me an hour and 20 minutes of his time. And I thought we had some really good content for you, but I went to listen to it. My voice sounded like I was in a tunnel. For me, it was almost insufferable. The good news is Demanya's told me what to do to fix this, and I've actually had 8 different podcast recordings since Raymond and I recorded this about 10 days ago, and none of them sound like I'm in a tunnel anymore. But I still think you're going to be able to listen to it. You're going to appreciate his warmth, his passion for students. It was great to reconnect with him. He was traveling on my Texas trip, so I missed him when I was at UT in late April. In this segment, we talk about how UT competes with, we talk about who UT competes with, and we talk about how UT admits by major and how the process of trying to do an internal transfer from one major to another actually works at UT. So let's dive in and learn about UT Austin from the Assistant Vice Provost. And by the way, a brand new doctor. He recently got his doctorate, Dr. Raymond Blakely. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I'm really stoked today. I am with Dr. Raymond Blakely from the University of Texas at Austin. But better known probably as just UT. Hey, Raymond, good to see you, man.
How's it going?
Great. Do you remember the last time I saw you? Because I remember.
Well, I think it must have been back in Georgia, right? Were you on my campus at Georgia College?
No, it was after that. You'd left Georgia College. We both did Harvard SECA, that 1 week of training.
That's right.
And I hung out with you guys a lot. You guys went to nice restaurants, lobster rolls, all that stuff.
Obviously, that was a good time, man. Anytime in Boston or in Cambridge is a great time. So, and it's so good to see you again. And thank you so much for all that you do to support students.
Thank you. Yeah, that was 2019. And you know what I remember? I was sitting in the front, you were sitting in the back, and you're like, if you call me Ramon one more time.
This is true.
So I'm with Raymond, but it's spelled, listeners, Ramon. And I was just having a hard time getting it right. And I'd seen Raymond multiple times by then, so he had every right to be miffed at me. And so he set me straight, and I don't think I've messed up since.
You would be surprised how often that happens. I live in the state of Texas, and so the first assumption is that is Ramon more often than not.
Yeah,
so
no
worries at all.
Yeah. So I'll say one thing, and then we're gonna have Raymond give us his backstory. So
sure. And
we're gonna talk about UT, and some of the questions we're gonna ask today are ones that you our listeners sent in. Some students. Remember I was at Texas. We couldn't quite coordinate our schedules then, but I met with a bunch of students when I was there, and some of the questions today come from them. So we'll get into that. But I do have to say something quickly. So this is a record for us because is Miguel still there, by the way? Is he still?
Miguel is here. He is the senior vice provost. He's over all of enrollment management.
Yeah. So I first met Miguel in 2018. He was speaking at the Westminster School in Atlanta. Okay. And that was the first time it was, I'll come on the podcast. And then you know how it is. People get busy, this, that, and the other. So here we are 7 years later. Like that's our all-time record. 7 years from the first ask to somebody going live. But persistence pays off, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah. So Raymond, tell our listeners anything at all about your backstory so they'll understand the context in which you'll speak today.
Yeah. Well, listen, Mark, once again, thank you so much for the opportunity. Like you, Mark, and you know this, I am a career college admissions professional. I've been doing this work for almost 28 years, and I have enjoyed, it's been the delight of my life to help students find their passions. And of course, I've been working, unlike you, at least now in this particular context, but working from the standpoint of the college. And so a total of 5 institutions, both public and private. I'm currently serving as Assistant Vice Provost of Admissions at UT Austin. I have always had a special place in my heart for this work because I was a student who did not have the resources that our students today have in terms of being able to navigate these spaces and being able to engage with colleges and universities that may where they may study in the end. And so I've enjoyed this. I've recently, in fact, I've even decided to study this work. I got a master's in school counseling, and also recently finished a doctorate in higher education leadership here at the University of Texas. And so this is what I do. This is the work that I enjoy, and I like to say it's the work that I get to do. It's a vocation for me, and I also it's never missed on me that I get the opportunity to engage with folks like yourself.
So tell us about your 5 institutions, because I don't know the 5. I did first meet you when you were at Raymond used to be at Georgia College, which is here in Milledgeville, right here in Georgia. And that was the first institution you were at when I first met you. So walk us through the 5 institutions.
Sure. So I started at the Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri, started out there as a graduate assistant and then moved into an admission counselor, then an assistant director. I then moved to St. Louis University, and I spent that's the longest that I've ever worked anywhere. It was at St. Louis University, nearly 10 years. St. Louis University is a private Catholic Jesuit institution in St. Louis, Missouri. And then I ventured to Texas, and I worked in the A&M system at the Kingsville campus, my first spot as director, and then headed out to Georgia, where we met at Georgia College and State University. And now I'm here at UT Austin, and I've been here at UT Austin approaching 7 years.
Awesome. Why don't you talk about the different roles you've had? Because I can't keep track of all your titles. Yeah. I remember when you were director of recruitment, and then you were interim director of admission. Now you're like assistant. So what, not so much the titles, although you can share them, but what are the different functions you've had within the office since you've been?
Sure. So here at the university, and when I joined UT Austin, I was focusing mainly on the recruitment aspect of everything. So I supervised all of our counselors. We are blessed here at UT to also have admission centers that are based in different locations throughout the state of Texas, with one in Dallas, one in Houston, and one in the Rio Grande Valley. So they each have a director, and I worked with the leaders of those admission centers to make sure that we were delivering recruitment to students throughout Texas as well as nationwide. That team also assisted with reading and all those types of things. So that was the first piece. And then I stepped into the interim role where I was more in a space where I was overseeing the Office of Admissions, but it was on a trial basis. And but then after that, I was named Assistant Vice Provost of Admissions. And essentially, it is a title that means that it encompasses the entire Office of Admissions, including international and all those different aspects of the office: recruitment, operations, compliance, as well as our campus-based campus visit, welcome center, that type of stuff as well. So everything that interfaces with students as they're making that transition to UT Austin, I have my hand in it in some way and leading the charge in terms of also setting strategy for the university.
Well, let's talk about UT. So you're in Hawaii, and an Uber driver's taking you around, and they asked you, how is UT different than the rest of the schools in the country? How would you unpack that?
Yeah, well, UT Austin's special, man. I think, and I can say this from experience, that they're really great schools throughout the country. And some schools are really good academically, strong academically. Some schools may not be as strong academically, but they're in really cool cities, right? And some schools may not be as strong academically, maybe in a smaller town, not a real cool city. Although, it's all relative, but they've got this really, really nice, strong spirit and strong athletic programs, right? I think the thing about UT Austin is it is probably one of the very few places that brings together all three aspects. So here we are in, one of the most popular cities in America, just about every ranking, Austin is usually in the top 15 in terms of places to live. We are at an institution that's ranked as, generally one of the top 10 public universities in the country. And that's something that not only is something that we see through our key performance indicators, but it's also what our peers say about us. So students have an opportunity to engage with some of the best professors in the world, engage with some of the strongest programs, a lot of top 5 programs, be it engineering, business, liberal arts. We've got a lot to offer here in the academic space, and a lot of great excellence here. But then also, we've got a great sports tradition here, man. And so, we now are obviously a part of the SEC, but, even before the SEC, this was a place that really believed in that whole idea of scholar athletes, but winning championships, having that winning tradition. But the spirit is here as well. And so, it's kind of like the best of all 3 worlds. And so if a student is looking for that holistic experience from their college, that holistic experience for college, this is a great opportunity and a great choice for them.
I was having a meeting last night with a student from North Jersey, very strong academically and wants that school spirit, and very open geographically. And I literally said to them, when I'm working with a student and they want that, they want top tier academics at a selective school, and they also want that school spirit. I say some of the private schools that oftentimes they are going to like are going to be Duke, Vanderbilt, USC, Northwestern. And some of the public schools they're going to like are going to be Michigan, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, UT, UCLA, UW in Seattle, and then Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm not meaning to slight anybody else, but those are just some of the schools that usually are top of mind for people that kind of want the combination of those 3 things. Obviously, Wisconsin weather is not Texas weather, so there's a little difference there. But are those some of the schools that you find you end up overlapping with?
Oh, quite a bit. And I think on the weather comment, I think Wisconsin probably is a better place in the summer than Austin, Texas. It's pretty hot, but you're 100% right. Those are schools that we very commonly hear that our students are who are considering us are also applying to them.
And I probably should have thrown in UVA, UGA, and UF. UGA, UVA, and UF also fit in that conversation as well. Yeah, absolutely. So I know that UT admits by major. In fact, something Miguel said, and I remember it very distinctly because at the time I didn't know this. You can tell me if this has changed or not. He said, if you apply for electrical engineering, he used biomedical as the example. You're applying for biomedical engineering and you can't necessarily transfer into electrical. I know you're not the only school that does that. Virginia Tech and others do that as well. My question for you is, how easy is it to transfer a major if you get to UT and you find out I didn't pick the right major, what that process looks like, and does it depend on the major? Unpack that for us, because that's a frequently asked question that I get about UT.
Yeah. So basically you're talking about our internal transfer process.
Yes.
And essentially students are here at the university and they are deciding that maybe the major that they were admitted into isn't the one they want to graduate with, right? It is competitive. So you're talking about students who have been admitted to the university, but they've been admitted to a major that they, have decided that it's not one that they want to graduate with. So we do have a process to assist those students, and it's called the internal transfer process. It's a competitive process, and believe it or not, our office also is involved in that process. We partner with the different colleges and schools that are here. And there are slots that do become available. But we always encourage students to do their due diligence and researching a major that they would like to graduate with on the onset, right? Because simply making that transfer from one major to another, if it's within two different colleges at the university, it can be a challenge. And sometimes it could mean that they are adding additional time before graduation. So that's one thing. The other part is it is going to be competitive. And so we want to make sure that when students are coming to UT, they're going to be happy with the major that they've been admitted into. And so we do our best to present all of the options and availability to them. In fact, when students apply for admission, they're going to list a first, a second choice, and if they're a student in the state of Texas who qualifies for automatic admission, they'll have another set of majors to choose from. Now, these are majors that we encourage the students to really think about they would be happy with no matter what. So to use the example that you gave, we're talking about, or your conversation with Miguel talking about biomedical engineering, that's going to be a very competitive major to transfer into. And so a student is going to have to really and truly, be among the best among the class of students that are making an application as an internal transfer to be able to successfully make that transition. And then in addition, they have to be thinking about, hey, in doing this, am I okay with the transition that it's going to take and the time at which it's going to take for me to complete my degree? It is competitive. That's the part. It's not any less competitive than if they were applying as an incoming freshman to that new major. In fact, it's probably more competitive because there are even fewer spaces that they're being considered for. Does that help?
Yeah. Are there any criteria that are used besides just your UT GPA when you're trying to make that decision, whether someone's granted an internal transfer? Like what other factors besides your
that's
GPA?
among the strongest factor. Obviously, if a student is coming in with already having some dual enrollment credit or AP credit in specific areas, that could be something that is taken into consideration. But mostly, it's going to be based upon what they've done here. So that application generally opens up April or May of their freshman year, and then they'll be notified sometime in the summer if they can make that transition in that following fall. So we would need to see 2 semesters or about close to 2 semesters of work before that would be possible for a freshman.
But besides GPA at UT, any other factors at all that are considered?
It's completely, everything's holistic. Okay. So involvement here on campus are always things that are also helpful.
For sure. What do you say to the student? And I wouldn't mind about $5 or $10 for every time I've been asked this. How can UT expect me to know what I'm going to do, like when I'm older? Like I'm 17 years old and there's so many majors and I'm just trying to get to know myself. Like, what's your answer to? I'm sure you've been asked that before because I've been asked it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question. And so it's something to take into consideration when you're considering UT Austin. I think the bigger piece too is to look at our success in graduation. So we're nation leading in terms of graduation rates at the 4-year level, and also as it relates to our retention rates are extremely high for a public university. And so a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're really, really honed in on identifying students who have a good sense as to what they want to study. Now, I will tell you, there are always going to be room for exploration, right? And opportunities for exploration. And a lot of times what we try to tell students is it's not always the fact that a major leads to a specific career path, right? Sometimes it's about getting the degree and maybe adding on a minor or adding on some type of experience that can help you land where you'd like to land in terms of your career or your passion. But we really do, and again, there are schools that are different, and I know you're going to help students with that. We really do try to identify the why behind where students are choosing, why they're choosing a major. Now, we have put together some resources for students as well. We do have a major finder tool online that students can navigate to and use as well, where they can kind of really do some research on the different opportunities that are available to them. And they also need to kind of challenge thinking as it relates to that. So many students want to go on to med school, and they think that the only way they can get into med school is if they major as an undergraduate in biology or chemistry. Well, there are lots of pathways that students can take into med school. It's about taking that pre-med core, but majoring in whatever is your passion would be helpful. Now, yes, having that lab experience that's associated with chemistry and biology, biochemistry, or whatever it may be, is going to be helpful for sure, but it isn't a must. And so what I'm always encouraging students and families to do is really think more broadly about those opportunities and the different pathways. And I'll tell you this, Mark, as well, this is also where we as a staff like to work directly with students. So we'd like to build that relationship, get to know what a student is interested in, and provide some additional assistance and guidance as they navigate some of these spaces.
Friends, this concludes this part of my interview with Raymond Blakely. Hope you join us next week for the next segment. Friends, on Monday's episode, I'm going to flip the order. We're going to start out with Bob Massa, and then we're going to close with our lawyers panel, our 5 students and our 2 partners of law firms. And both of them are parts 3 of 5, and that's the whole entire episode. And it'll be that way for the whole month of August. You want to know the August episode? Half of it's Bob Massa, Susan and I interviewing Bob. Half of it is the lawyer panel, all 5 weeks in August. That's the agenda. But, I was thinking, friends, about the pressure students are under, and especially if you're in affluent suburbs or private schools, and especially if you're on the coast, or, in other places too. It's not just the coast. It's really in places really where there's pockets of wealth, right? Like I see it in suburban Chicago. I see it in other places. It's most prevalent on the coast. This incredible pressure that students face to impress their peers with where they go to college, because we've caught up in this whole rankings mentality rather than have a mindset of trying on attending a college is like getting a custom suit, getting a custom pair of shoes that fit your foot. And the one thing I thought about is if students can realize that all that pressure you're feeling, the pressure of I got to have a certain t-shirt, or I got the big social media release where you blast your school out, it is just temporary. It is just ephemeral. It is just evanescent. It's here and it's gone like a puff of smoke. And as soon as you go into a brand new milieu, a new environment, I'm talking about college, and a whole different group around you, it's a whole different mindset and a whole different perspective. I know when you're in the middle of it, it just feels so real. The pressure parents feel, the pressure students feel. But everything changes when you get out of that echo chamber. And I hope that you will emblazon on your forehead, college is not a prize to be won. College is a match to be made. See you Monday, friends. And that's our show. Big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you will get every single episode as soon as they are released. If you want to support our podcast, you can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can say positive things about your college-bound kid on your social media feed. And you can help us stay commercial-free and pay our staff by donating on the yourcollegeboundkid.website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. And if you have a question or a recommendation, just go to speakpipe.com/YCBK, hit the orange button, and speak. We will do our best to get your question in your own voice on an upcoming episode. I am the producer of the podcast, and I live in Metro Atlanta. We have a fantastic team that has over 200 years of admissions and counseling experience. Shout out to our co-hosts, Dr. Lisa Ruff in North Carolina, Susan Tree in Pennsylvania, Vince Garcia in California, Julia Esquivel in Massachusetts, Linda Depker in Missouri, Andy Strickler, the Chief Enrollment Officer at Connecticut College, New London, Connecticut, Hillary Dickman, an Admission Officer at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, and our International Admissions Expert, Kevin Newton in Dallas, Texas. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Matvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs from Kimberly Bloss. Our reliable webmaster is Stylionis Dimitru. Website updates are done by Joyce Stucker. Our image editor is Vlad Honchar. If you want to have a coaching session with me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you want to reach someone else on our team, all of our bios with contact info can be found at yourcollegeboundkid.com under the About YCBK tab. If you want to get our free monthly YCBK newsletter, YCBK Plus, it is also under the About YCBK tab. If you want to see our recommended books and websites, they are on our website under the Resources tab. While you're on our website, check out our hundreds of interviews in their entirety. Check out our college spotlights, our blog, and our upcoming events. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting with you every single Monday and every single Thursday.